Sarah Mitchell had always dreamed of serving her country, but she never imagined it would lead her to the gates of Buckingham Palace. Standing at 5 feet 8 inches, with sharp green eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a perfect bun, she looked every bit the professional soldier she had trained to be. Today marked her first day as a member of the Queen's Guard, a position that fewer than 24 women had ever held in the regiment's long history. The morning air was crisp as Sarah adjusted her red tunic and straightened her bearskin hat. The uniform felt heavy on her shoulders, not just from its physical weight, but from the centuries of tradition it represented. She had spent months preparing for this moment, studying every protocol, every movement, every rule that governed the behavior of the Royal Guards. The training had been brutal, both physically and mentally, but she had pushed through every challenge that came her way. As she took her position outside the palace gates, Sarah could feel the eyes of tourists and passers-by on her. Some looked curious, others skeptical. She had grown accustomed to the stares during her military career. Being a woman in a traditionally male-dominated field meant constantly proving herself worthy of the uniform she wore, but this felt different. This was the pinnacle of military ceremonial duty, and she was determined to excel. The first few hours passed without incident. Sarah maintained her rigid posture, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her expression blank and professional. The tourists snapped photos and whispered among themselves, but she remained motionless, a living statue representing the unwavering dedication of the British military. Her feet began to ache in her polished boots, and sweat started to form under the heavy bearskin, but she showed no sign of discomfort. Around midday, a group of school children approached with their teacher. They were clearly on a field trip, their excited chatter filling the air as they marveled at the palace and its guards. Sarah noticed them from the corner of her eye but maintained her stoic stance. The teacher was explaining the history of the guards, pointing out the different details of the uniform and the importance of the ceremony. One little girl, no more than 7 years old, broke away from the group and approached Sarah directly. She had curly blonde hair tied in pigtails and wore a bright blue school uniform. The child stood directly in front of Sarah, staring up at her with wide, curious eyes. Sarah could see her reflection in the child's innocent gaze, but protocol demanded she remain absolutely still and silent. The little girl tilted her head and asked in a clear, sweet voice, "Are you real?" The question hung in the air, simple, yet profound. Other tourists began to gather, phones ready to capture any reaction. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at the child's innocent curiosity, but her training kicked in. She remained perfectly still, not even blinking more than necessary. The teacher hurried over, apologizing profusely and trying to pull the child away. But the little girl was persistent. She took another step closer and asked again, "Can you hear me? I think you're very brave." The words struck something deep in Sarah's heart. Here was this small child, looking at her not with skepticism or doubt, but with genuine admiration and wonder. More people began to stop and watch the interaction. Some were filming, others were encouraging the child to try to get a reaction from the guard. Sarah could feel the pressure building around her. Every instinct told her to maintain her composure, to follow her training, to be the perfect example of discipline and duty. But something about this moment felt different, more significant than just another day of ceremonial duty. The little girl reached into her small backpack and pulled out a drawing she had made. It was a colorful picture of a palace guard, clearly, meant to represent someone just like Sarah. The child held it up proudly and said, "I made this for you because I want to be brave like you when I grow up." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her resolve beginning to waver. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people pushing closer to see what would happen. Cameras were flashing, and Sarah could hear whispered conversations about whether the guard would break protocol. The pressure was immense, but all Sarah could focus on was the hopeful expression on the little girl's face and the genuine kindness in her gesture. Sarah's military training had prepared her for many situations, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of pure human connection. She thought about her own childhood, about the people who had inspired her to pursue a career in the military, about the responsibility she bore as one of the first women in this prestigious position. The weight of representation felt heavier than her ceremonial uniform. The little girl waited patiently, still holding up her drawing, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. The teacher had given up trying to pull her away and stood back with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. The crowd continued to grow, creating a semicircle around the scene. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do. In that moment, Sarah realized that this was about more than just following rules or maintaining tradition. This was about the impact she could have on a young girl's life, about being a role model, about showing that strength and kindness could coexist. The little girl saw her as brave, as someone to look up to, and Sarah suddenly understood the true weight of that responsibility. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah made her decision. Everything she had trained for, everything she had worked toward, had led to this single moment. She knew that whatever she chose to do next would not only affect her own career, but could potentially change how people viewed the guards, the military, and women in positions of authority. The little girl continued to wait, her faith in Sarah's goodness unwavering, and Sarah felt something inside her begin to shift. Sarah's heart pounded beneath her red tunic as she stared down at the little girl holding the colorful drawing. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like the heavy bearskin hat on her head. Every fiber of her military training screamed at her to maintain position, to remain the perfect, unmoving symbol of duty and discipline. But looking into those innocent, hopeful eyes, she felt something deeper stirring within her soul. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, all holding their breath to see what would happen. Phones and cameras were pointed in her direction, ready to capture whatever decision she made. Sarah could hear the whispered conversations, some people betting she would remain rigid, others hoping she might show some humanity. The pressure was unlike anything she had experienced in combat or training. In a moment that would change everything, Sarah made her choice. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, she began to lower her head. The movement was slight, just enough to make eye contact with the little girl. The child's face lit up like sunrise, her smile spreading from ear to ear as she realized the guard was acknowledging her. The crowd gasped collectively, some applauding softly, others simply staring in amazement. But Sarah didn't stop there. With deliberate, careful movements, she bent down to one knee, bringing herself to the child's eye level. The motion was graceful despite the restrictive uniform, years of military training evident in her controlled movements. The little girl stepped forward eagerly, her drawing clutched in her small hands, her eyes sparkling with joy and excitement. Sarah reached out with her white-gloved hand and gently took the drawing from the child. She studied it carefully, noting every crayon stroke, every careful detail the little girl had included. The drawing showed a guard standing tall and proud, with a big smile on their face and the words "My Hero" written in uneven letters across the top. Sarah felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, but maintained her composure. Looking directly at the little girl, Sarah spoke in a soft but clear voice that carried to the entire crowd. "This is the most beautiful drawing I have ever received. Thank you for seeing the person behind the uniform." Her words were simple, but carried profound meaning. The little girl beamed with pride and threw her arms around Sarah's neck in an impromptu hug that nearly knocked off the tall bearskin hat. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. People were crying, laughing, and capturing the moment on their phones. What had started as a simple interaction between a child and a guard had transformed into something magical, something that touched the hearts of everyone present. Sarah carefully stood back up, the drawing still in her hand, and resumed her position. But word of the incident spread faster than Sarah could have imagined. Within hours, videos of the interaction were circulating on social media platforms around the world. News outlets picked up the story, calling it everything from a moment of humanity to guard breaks protocol for child's drawing. The footage showed Sarah's gentle interaction with the little girl, capturing the tenderness in her eyes and the genuine care she showed. By evening, Sarah found herself called into the office of her commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison. He was a stern man in his 50s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes who had served in the regiment for over 3 decades. His office was decorated with military honors and photographs from various ceremonies, a testament to his long and distinguished career. Colonel Harrison sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable as he watched the viral video on his computer screen. Sarah stood at attention in front of his desk, still wearing her ceremonial uniform, the little girl's drawing carefully tucked inside her jacket. She knew she was in trouble, but she couldn't bring herself to regret her actions. The joy on that child's face had been worth whatever consequences she might face. After what felt like an eternity, the colonel looked up at her and asked, "Do you understand what you've done, Guardsman Mitchell?" His voice was measured and professional, giving away nothing of his thoughts on the matter. Sarah met his gaze steadily and replied, "Yes, sir. I broke protocol by acknowledging a member of the public while on duty." The colonel leaned back in his chair and studied her carefully. "You did more than break protocol. You've created an international incident. The phone hasn't stopped ringing all day. We have news crews outside the gates, reporters calling from around the world, and the palace is asking questions." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Your actions have brought more attention to the regiment than we've had in decades." Sarah remained at attention, preparing herself for whatever punishment was coming. She knew that breaking the strict protocols of the Queen's Guard was a serious offense that could result in her removal from the position she had worked so hard to achieve. But as she stood there, she thought about the little girl's face, about the drawing still pressed against her heart, and she knew she would make the same choice again. The colonel continued. "However, the nature of that attention is what we need to discuss." He turned his computer screen toward her, showing the flood of positive comments and messages that had accompanied the viral video. "People are calling you a hero. They're saying you represent the best of what it means to serve. Children around. The world are asking their parents about the guards because of what you did." Sarah felt a flicker of surprise, but maintained her military bearing. She had expected criticism, not praise. The colonel stood up and walked around his desk to face her directly. "The question now is what we do about this situation. You broke a fundamental rule of the Guard, but you also reminded the world that behind these uniforms are real people with real hearts." As the colonel spoke, Sarah realized that her moment of compassion had opened a conversation about tradition, humanity, and the role of ceremonial duties in modern society. The little girl's simple question, "Are you real?" had become a catalyst for something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. The drawing in her jacket seemed to pulse with the weight of possibility, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures can create the biggest changes. Colonel Harrison walked to the window overlooking the palace grounds, his hands clasped behind his back in typical military fashion. The silence in the office stretched on as Sarah waited for his decision. Outside, she could see the news vans that had gathered, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. The weight of global attention felt surreal after years of serving in relative anonymity. "Sit down, Mitchell," the colonel said finally, his tone softer than before. Sarah moved to the chair across from his desk, maintaining her straight posture despite the permission to relax. This was uncharted territory for both of them. The colonel returned to his seat and opened a thick folder that Sarah recognized as her personnel file. "I've been reviewing your record," he began, flipping through pages of commendations and training reports. "Outstanding marks in every category. Exceptional performance in Afghanistan. 3 commendations for bravery under fire. You've earned the right to be here through merit, not politics or publicity." He looked up at her directly. "That's why this situation is so complicated." Sarah felt her throat tighten slightly. She had worked harder than most of her male counterparts to prove herself worthy of this position. Every evaluation had been scrutinized more carefully, every mistake magnified because of her gender. Now, in one moment of human kindness, all of that careful reputation building might be undone. The colonel continued. "The traditional response would be to remove you from ceremonial duties immediately. The protocols exist for good reasons, and maintaining discipline requires consistent enforcement of the rules." He paused, studying her reaction. "However, the response to your actions has been unlike anything we've seen before." He turned his computer screen toward her again, this time showing news articles from around the world. Headlines in multiple languages praised her compassion and humanity. Social media was flooded with support, with many people sharing their own stories of times when small acts of kindness had made enormous differences in their lives. The hashtag #WereRealGuard was trending globally. "The palace has been receiving calls all day," the colonel said. "Not complaints, but praise. Parents thanking us for showing their children that strength and kindness can coexist. Veterans saying you reminded them why they served. International dignitaries commenting on the positive image you've created for Britain." He leaned forward. "The Queen herself has requested a briefing on the situation." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at this revelation. The idea that her actions had reached the attention of the monarch she had sworn to protect was both thrilling and terrifying. She had always imagined that if she ever came to the Queen's attention, it would be for exemplary service, not for breaking protocol. "There's more," the colonel continued. "We've received over 1,000 applications from young women wanting to join the Guards in the past 12 hours alone. Recruitment offices across the country are reporting increased interest from people who saw your video and were inspired to serve." He smiled slightly for the first time during their conversation. "One little girl in Scotland sent a letter saying she wants to be a kind guard like you when she grows up." The impact of her simple gesture was becoming clearer with each revelation. What had felt like a personal moment between her and one child had somehow resonated with people across the globe. Sarah thought about all the times she had wondered if her service mattered, if the ceremonial duties were just empty tradition. Now she was seeing that symbols could have real power to inspire and unite people. The colonel stood up and moved to a cabinet where he kept his most important documents. He withdrew an official-looking folder and placed it on his desk. "I've been in communication with the Ministry of Defense and senior palace officials all afternoon. We've reached a decision that is frankly unprecedented in the history of the regiment." Sarah braced herself for whatever was coming. The folder could contain her discharge papers, a transfer order, or any number of official actions. She had accepted that her career might end here, but she hoped her actions might at least inspire positive changes for future guards. "We're creating a new position," the colonel announced. "Community liaison guard, you'll maintain your ceremonial duties, but you'll also be authorized to engage with the public in approved ways: school visits, charity events, hospital visits to sick children. We want to harness this positive energy and use it to strengthen the connection between the military and the people we serve." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. Instead of punishment, she was being offered an opportunity to expand her service in ways she had never imagined. The little girl's drawing, still tucked against her heart, seemed to pulse with validation. "There are conditions, of course," the colonel continued. "You'll undergo additional training on public relations and community engagement. Every interaction will be carefully planned and supervised. You'll be representing not just yourself, but the entire institution of the monarchy and military. The scrutiny will be intense." Sarah found her voice. "Sir, I accept whatever responsibilities come with this opportunity. If I can inspire even one child the way that little girl inspired me today, it will be worth any challenge." The colonel nodded approvingly. "I hoped you'd say that. Your first official engagement is tomorrow. The little girl who gave you the drawing, Emma Thompson, is in the hospital. She has leukemia and was on a special outing when she met you today. Her parents contacted us after seeing the news coverage. They'd like you to visit her." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The brave little girl who had approached her with such confidence and joy was fighting a battle far more serious than Sarah had realized. Suddenly, the significance of their interaction took on new dimensions. Emma had been facing her own fears and challenges, yet she had found the courage to reach out and connect with another person. "I'll be honored to visit her, sir," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "And sir? Thank you for seeing the potential in what happened today instead of just the breach of protocol." The colonel smiled genuinely now. "Sometimes, Mitchell, the most important rules are the ones we write in our hearts, not in our manuals. That little girl saw something real in you today, and the world saw it too. Now we get to find out what we can build from that foundation." The next morning dawned gray and drizzly. Typical London weather that seemed to match the weight of emotion Sarah carried as she prepared for her hospital visit. She had spent the night thinking about Emma, the brave little girl who had unknowingly changed the course of her career and possibly her entire life. Learning about Emma's battle with leukemia had transformed their brief encounter from a simple moment of connection into something profound and heartbreaking. Sarah chose to wear her dress uniform rather than the ceremonial red tunic. The dark blue jacket with its polished buttons and crisp lines felt more appropriate for a hospital setting. She carefully tucked Emma's drawing into her jacket pocket, the same place it had rested since the previous day. The colorful paper had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of the power of innocent hope and genuine human connection. Great Ormond Street Hospital was renowned for its pediatric care, and as Sarah walked through the corridors, she was struck by the contrast between the serious medical environment and the cheerful decorations, clearly meant to lift young spirits. Cartoon characters painted on walls, colorful play areas, and the sound of children's laughter mixed with the more somber realities of serious illness. Emma's parents, David and Margaret Thompson, were waiting in the family room when Sarah arrived. David was a tall, thin man with kind eyes that showed the strain of his daughter's illness. Margaret was petite, with Emma's same blonde curls, though hers were pulled back in a tired ponytail. Both looked as though they hadn't slept properly in weeks, but their faces lit up with genuine gratitude when they saw Sarah approach. "Guardsman Mitchell," Margaret said, standing quickly. "Thank you so much for coming. Emma has been talking about nothing but meeting you again since we saw the news last night. She's been showing everyone in the ward your picture on our phone." Her voice carried the particular mixture of pride and worry that belonged to parents of seriously ill children. David shook Sarah's hand firmly. "What you did yesterday meant more to Emma than you could possibly know. She's been in treatment for 8 months now, and yesterday was the first time in weeks we've seen her genuinely excited about something. You gave her hope when she needed it most." Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion. "Your daughter gave me something precious, too," she replied. "Her courage and kindness reminded me why I chose to serve. I'm honored to be here with her today." Margaret led Sarah down a corridor lined with rooms where young patients were receiving treatment. Through open doors, Sarah could see children of various ages, some playing games, others resting, all fighting battles that no child should have to face. The strength she witnessed in these brief glimpses was humbling and inspiring. Emma's room was decorated with drawings from classmates, get-well cards, and stuffed animals. The little girl was propped up in bed wearing pajamas covered in cartoon princesses, with a colorful headscarf covering her head where her hair had been lost to chemotherapy. Despite her obvious illness, her eyes still held the same spark Sarah remembered from their meeting at the palace gates. "You came," Emma exclaimed, her face breaking into the same radiant smile that had captured Sarah's heart the day before. "I knew you were real. I told all the nurses that you were my friend and that you would come see me." Sarah approached the bed slowly, not wanting to overwhelm the child. "I couldn't stay away from such a brave friend," she said, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "I brought your drawing with me. It's been keeping me company since yesterday." Emma's eyes widened with delight as Sarah carefully withdrew the artwork from her pocket. "You really kept it?" "Mummy said you probably had to give it back because guards aren't allowed to keep things. But I hoped you would find a way." "This drawing is very special to me," Sarah said, smoothing it gently on the bedside table. "It reminds me that being brave isn't about never being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared. You taught me that yesterday." Emma considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "I was a little scared to talk to you," she admitted. "But you looked kind, and I wanted to give you my picture. I made it after we learned about the guards at school before I got too sick to go back." The casual way Emma mentioned her illness struck Sarah deeply. This child was facing something terrifying with a matter-of-fact acceptance that many adults couldn't manage. Sarah found herself learning from Emma's example once again. "Can I tell you a secret?" Sarah asked, leaning closer. Emma nodded eagerly. "When I was standing there yesterday, I was scared too. Scared that I might not be good enough at my job, scared that people would think I didn't belong there. But when you came up to me with your drawing, you showed me that being good enough isn't about being perfect. It's about caring about people." Emma reached out and took Sarah's gloved hand in her small one. "Is that why you knelt down to talk to me? Because you cared?" "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "And because I could see that you have the same kind of bravery that makes a good soldier. The kind that comes from your heart." Over the next hour, Sarah and Emma talked about everything from palace life to favorite colors to what Emma wanted to be when she grew up. Emma's energy was infectious despite her illness, and Sarah found herself laughing more genuinely than she had in months. Other children from the ward began to drift into the room, drawn by the unusual sight of a uniformed guard sitting with their friend. Soon, Sarah found herself surrounded by a small group of young patients, each eager to hear stories about palace life and military service. She told them about the changing of the guard, about the training required to stand so still, and about the honor of serving their country. But more importantly, she listened to their stories, their fears, their hopes, and their dreams. One boy asked if she was scared when she had to stand guard alone. A girl wanted to know if the queen was as nice as she seemed on television. Another child, barely 5 years old and clutching a teddy bear, asked if being brave was something you had to learn or something you were born with. Sarah answered each question thoughtfully, but found that the children were teaching her as much as she was teaching them. Their resilience in the face of illness, their ability to find joy in small moments, their immediate acceptance of her as simply another person rather than a symbol, all of it challenged her understanding of what true strength looked like. As visiting hours drew to a close, Emma presented Sarah with another drawing, this one created during her hospital stay. It showed two figures standing together, a guard and a little girl, both smiling broadly. Across the top, in Emma's careful handwriting, were the words, "Friends forever." "This is for you to keep too," Emma said. "So you remember that being real is the best way to be brave." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she carefully folded the new drawing and placed it beside the first one in her pocket. "I will treasure this always, Emma, and I promise to remember what you've taught me about real bravery." As Sarah prepared to leave, Margaret walked her to the corridor. "Thank you," she said simply. "Emma has been different since meeting you." More hopeful. "She's been talking about getting better so she can come see you guard the palace again." Sarah squeezed Margaret's hand gently. "Emma has changed me too. She's reminded me that the most important part of serving others is seeing them as individuals, not just as part of a crowd. I hope I can visit again soon." Walking out of the hospital, Sarah realized that her role as a guard had evolved into something she had never expected. She wasn't just protecting buildings or maintaining traditions anymore. She was connecting people, inspiring hope, and learning about courage from the most unlikely teachers. 3 weeks after her visit to Great Ormond Street Hospital, Sarah's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The video of her interaction with Emma had not only gone viral, but had sparked a global conversation about the role of tradition in modern society, the importance of human connection, and the power of small acts of kindness. News outlets from around the world had covered the story, and Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm she was still learning to navigate. Her new role as community liaison guard had officially begun, and her schedule was packed with carefully planned engagements. She had visited 3 more hospitals, attended a ceremony honoring military families, and participated in a school assembly where she spoke about service and dedication. Each event had been meaningful, but none had captured the spontaneous magic of that first moment with Emma. The most significant change, however, was yet to come. Colonel Harrison had called Sarah into his office once again, but this time his demeanor was different. There was an excitement in his eyes that she had never seen before, mixed with something that looked almost like nervousness. "Mitchell," he began, gesturing for her to sit down. "I have news that will either be the greatest honor of your career or the most terrifying responsibility you've ever faced. Possibly both." He paused dramatically before continuing. "Her Majesty, the Queen has requested to meet with you personally." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly around her. In all her dreams of military service, she had imagined many scenarios, but a private audience with the Queen had never been among them. She tried to maintain her composure, but her voice cracked slightly as she responded. "Sir, when is this meeting scheduled?" "Tomorrow afternoon at Windsor Castle," the colonel replied. "This is completely unprecedented, Mitchell. The Queen doesn't typically meet with individual guards, especially not regarding matters of protocol. But the impact of your actions has reached the highest levels of the monarchy, and she wants to speak with you directly." The next 24 hours passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Sarah was briefed on proper protocol for meeting. The monarch, coached on appropriate conversation topics, and fitted for a special dress uniform that would be suitable for the occasion. But beneath all the formal preparation, she couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was about more than just protocol or public relations. Windsor Castle loomed majestically as Sarah's car approached the ancient walls. The fortress had been home to British royalty for nearly 1,000 years, and Sarah felt the weight of that history as she was escorted through corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress. She was led to a private sitting room that was elegant but comfortable, filled with family photographs and personal touches that made it feel more like a home than a palace. Sarah stood at attention, her heart pounding as she waited for the Queen to arrive. When the door opened and Queen Elizabeth II entered the room, Sarah was struck by how petite and graceful the monarch appeared in person. At 96 years old, the Queen still carried herself with the dignity and presence that had defined her 7-decade reign. She was dressed simply in a blue dress with a string of pearls, looking more like someone's grandmother than the head of state of multiple nations. "Guardsman Mitchell," the Queen said, her voice clear and warm. "Thank you for coming to see me. Please sit down. I understand you prefer tea to coffee?" Sarah was surprised by the informality of the greeting. "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you." She sat carefully on the edge of an ornate chair, maintaining perfect posture despite her nervousness. The Queen settled into her own chair and studied Sarah, with intelligent eyes that had seen decades of history unfold. "I've been following the story of your encounter with young Emma Thompson," she began. "It's caused quite a stir, hasn't it? Not just here in Britain, but around the world. Yes, Your Majesty. I never expected such a response to what felt like a simple moment of human connection. The Queen smiled slightly. In my experience, the most profound changes often come from the simplest gestures. I've been thinking a great deal about that day, about what it represents and what it might teach us about the future of our institutions. A staff member brought in a tea service, and the Queen personally poured for both of them, a gesture that felt both surreal and oddly comforting to Sarah. The monarch's hands were steady and sure, speaking to a lifetime of practice with such ceremonies. You know, the Queen continued, I've spent my entire life balancing tradition with the need for evolution. The monarchy, like all institutions, must find ways to remain relevant while honoring its history. What you did that day with Emma showed me something important about that balance. Sarah sipped her tea, waiting for the Queen to elaborate. She had never imagined that her split-second decision to acknowledge a child's kindness would lead to conversations about the future of the monarchy itself. The guards have always been symbols, the Queen explained. Symbols of strength, dedication, unwavering duty. These are important qualities vital to what they represent. But symbols can become distant, untouchable, more like statues than people. What you showed the world is that our greatest strength comes not from being untouchable, but from being genuinely human while maintaining our principles. The Queen paused to take a sip of her tea before continuing. Emma Thompson's parents wrote, to me, they wanted to thank not just you, but the institution you represent for showing their daughter that strength and kindness can coexist. They said it gave Emma hope during her treatment, and that hope was contagious throughout the children's ward. Sarah felt tears threatening but managed to maintain her composure. Emma taught me more about bravery than any military training ever could, Your Majesty. She showed me that real courage often looks like a small child approaching a stranger with nothing but trust and kindness. Exactly, the Queen said, leaning forward slightly. And that brings me to why I wanted to speak with you personally. I'm considering some changes to how we approach our ceremonial duties. Not abandoning tradition, but finding ways to make those traditions more accessible, more human. The implications of what the Queen was suggesting began to dawn on Sarah. This wasn't just about her individual actions anymore, but about potentially reshaping centuries of protocol and tradition. I want you to help develop a new approach to ceremonial duties, the Queen continued. One that maintains the dignity and respect our institutions deserve while acknowledging that the people we serve are not distant subjects, but individuals, with their own stories, their own needs for connection and hope. Sarah set down her teacup with trembling hands. Your Majesty, I'm honored by your confidence in me, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to make decisions about traditions that have existed for centuries. The Queen smiled more broadly now. My dear, you've already made the most important decision. When faced with the choice between rigid protocol and human compassion, you chose compassion without sacrificing your dignity or your duty. That's exactly the kind of judgment we need as we move forward. As their conversation continued, Sarah realized that Emma's simple question, "Are you real?" had sparked something much larger than either of them could have imagined. It had become a catalyst for examining how ancient institutions could remain meaningful in a modern world, how tradition and humanity could work together rather than in opposition. The Queen concluded their meeting by asking Sarah to head a special committee that would work on developing new guidelines for public engagement during ceremonial duties. It would be delicate work, balancing respect for tradition with the need for genuine human connection. I have one condition, Your Majesty, Sarah said as they prepared to conclude their meeting. I'd like Emma Thompson to be involved in our discussion somehow. She started this conversation and I think her perspective would be valuable. The Queen's eyes twinkled with approval. I think that's a wonderful idea. After all, she seems to understand better than most of us what it means to be real while being brave. 6 months later, Sarah stood once again at the gates of Buckingham Palace. But everything had changed. The red tunic felt the same on her shoulders. The bearskin hat still carried its familiar weight. But her role had evolved into something she could never have imagined. The new protocols she had helped develop were now in effect, allowing guards to acknowledge the public in appropriate circumstances while maintaining the dignity and respect that centuries of tradition demanded. The committee work had been intensive and sometimes challenging, balancing the views of traditionalists who worried about diminishing the ceremonial significance of the guards with progressives who wanted wholesale changes had required careful negotiation and compromise. But Emma Thompson had indeed been involved in the discussions, participating through video calls from her hospital bed and later from her home as her treatment progressed successfully. Emma's insights had been surprisingly profound for someone so young. She had helped the committee understand that people didn't want the guards to become casual or approachable in a way that diminished their significance. Instead, they wanted to know that behind the ceremonial roles were real people who cared about those they served. The new guidelines reflected this understanding, allowing for brief acknowledgments of children, veterans, and others in special circumstances while maintaining the essential dignity of the position. Today marked the official launch of the new approach, and Sarah was nervous about how it would be received. News crews were positioned around the palace, ready to document whether the changes would enhance or diminish the traditional ceremony. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than her uniform as she took her position for the changing of the guard ceremony. The crowd that had gathered was larger than usual, drawn by curiosity about the new protocols. Sarah could see familiar faces among the tourists and locals, including several children from the hospital ward she had visited, their families having brought them to witness this historic moment. Emma was there too, her hair growing back in soft curls beneath a colorful knit cap, her eyes bright with excitement and health. As the ceremony began, Sarah maintained the traditional stoic expression and rigid posture that had defined the guards for generations. The precise movements, the coordinated steps, the disciplined silence all proceeded exactly as they had for centuries. The new guidelines didn't change the ceremony itself, only how guards could interact with the public before and after their formal duties. When the ceremony concluded and Sarah took her position for the regular guard duty, she noticed a young boy approaching with his grandfather. The elderly man walked with the aid of a cane and wore a military beret that suggested he was a veteran. The boy, probably around 8 years old, hung back shyly as his grandfather spoke to him in encouraging whispers. Under the old protocols, Sarah would have been required to remain completely motionless and silent regardless of who approached. Under the new guidelines, she was authorized to acknowledge veterans and their families in appropriate ways. As the grandfather and grandson came closer, she could see the old man pointing to her uniform and explaining something to the boy in hushed, reverent tones. The grandfather stepped forward and stood at a respectful distance. "Guardsman," he said softly, "I served with the Welsh Guards in Korea. My grandson here has been learning about military service, and meeting you would mean the world to him." The man's voice carried the particular quality of someone who understood military protocols and the significance of what he was asking. Sarah made a barely perceptible nod, acknowledging the veteran with the respect he deserved. The gesture was small but meaningful, recognizing the shared bond of service while maintaining her ceremonial dignity. The grandfather's face lit up with gratitude, and he gently pushed his grandson forward. The boy approached slowly, clutching a small British flag in his hand. When he reached an appropriate distance, he stopped and said clearly, "Thank you for protecting us." Then, in a gesture that mirrored Emma's action months earlier, he held up his flag as an offering. Sarah's training under the new protocols allowed her to accept small tokens from children in specific circumstances. She carefully reached out and accepted the flag, holding it respectfully for a moment before securing it appropriately on her uniform. The boy beamed with pride, and his grandfather snapped a photo that would undoubtedly become a treasured family memory. As word spread through the crowd about the interaction, more people began to approach, but not in the chaotic rush that Sarah had feared. Instead, there was an understanding, almost reverent quality to how visitors engaged with her. Parents explained to their children about appropriate behavior, veterans shared brief nods of mutual respect, and everyone seemed to understand that they were witnessing something special, tradition evolving while maintaining its essential character. Throughout the day, Sarah had several meaningful interactions. A little girl who had lost her father in military service was brought forward by her mother to meet someone who represented his values and sacrifice. An elderly woman who had served as a nurse during World War II shared a moment of mutual recognition with Sarah about the meaning of service. Each interaction was brief, respectful, and profound in its own way. Emma Thompson and her family approached near the end of Sarah's shift. Emma looked healthy and vibrant, her recovery from leukemia progressing, better than doctors had initially hoped. She carried with her a thick folder that turned out to be filled with drawings from children around the world who had been inspired by the story of her first meeting with Sarah. "These are for all the guards," Emma explained, her voice stronger, now than it had been in the hospital months earlier. Kids from everywhere wanted to send pictures to say thank you for being real and brave at the same time. Sarah accepted the folder with the same care she had shown Emma's first drawing. "This is incredible, Emma. You've created something beautiful here. Connections between children and the people who serve them." Emma smiled, the same radiant smile that had started everything. "I learned from you that being brave means caring about people, even when it might be hard or scary. Now lots of kids know that too." As Sarah's shift ended and she prepared to be relieved by the next guard, she reflected on how much had changed since that first moment when Emma had asked if she was real. The question had sparked a transformation that went far beyond military protocols or tourist interactions. It had reminded everyone involved that the most important traditions were not about rigid rules, but about the values those rules were meant to protect: service, dedication, and genuine care for others. The new protocols were being implemented at other royal residences and were already being studied by ceremonial units in other countries. What had started as one guard's instinctive response to a child's kindness had become a model for how ancient traditions could evolve to remain meaningful in a changing world. That evening, Sarah returned to her quarters to find a letter waiting for her. It was from the Queen, written in her own hand on official stationery. The message was brief but profound. "Thank you for reminding us all that the highest form of service is seeing and honoring the humanity in those we serve. Your courage in that moment of choice has enriched our understanding of what it truly means to guard what matters most." Sarah carefully placed the letter alongside Emma's drawings in her personal collection of treasured items. Each piece represented a moment when someone had chosen connection over convention, courage over comfort, humanity over rigid protocol. Together, they told the story of how a simple question from a brave little girl had changed not just one guard's life, but the very nature of what it meant to serve with honor in the modern world. Emma's question, "Are you real?" had been answered not just with words, but with actions that demonstrated the most real thing of all: the power of human compassion to transform traditions, institutions, and lives in ways both profound and lasting.